well as provide additional information on the post-World War II context and the launch of the development project. At the end of World War II, a number of the global institutions that exist today were created, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, which is the precursor to the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations. There was a meeting in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a meeting in which 44 countries came together to plan the post-war global economy. The Bretton Woods meeting was to bring together countries to negotiate and set up a system of rules to regulate the international monetary system in order to create economic stability, as well as discuss how to go about rebuilding Europe after the wartime destruction. It was framed as a multilateral effort to raise living standards around the world. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established at this time. The US sent the largest delegation and had the most influence. These were not structured as democratic institutions based on an equal vote for each country. European countries, the US and Japan, constituted only 20% of the membership, but had nearly 2/3 of the vote. A country's voting power in the bank was determined by its national income, foreign reserves, and contribution to international trade. The US has more than 15% of the vote, which allows it to veto decisions it opposes, since important decisions require 85% support. The US is the only country with veto power, with 15.98% of the vote. In 2003, for example, the US, with its veto power, blocked an initiative to give developing nations more of a vote within the World Bank. The US also has the most voting power in the IMF, with 16.52% of the vote. The US chooses the president of the World Bank, and Europe chooses the head of the IMF. The post-war international economy was structured mainly by the countries of the First World, in particular the US. The US emerged as a superpower in the post-war period. US hegemony was consolidated in the decade following the end of World War II. The US was economically and militarily powerful. The country had a really high standard of living measured by per capita income. It had a high degree of legitimacy as a former colony that had overthrown its colonizers and developed. It was seen as a model for other countries to follow, and it had a lot of influence on a global level. The World Bank initially focused on reconstructing Europe. It soon shifted its focus onto the colonies that were gaining independence post-World War II. Most of the early loans from the bank went to power and transportation projects, that is, major infrastructure projects. In the 1950s and 1960s, more than 60% of loans were for infrastructure projects. The bank didn't give out loans for health, education, or other social services. In addition to financing national infrastructure projects, the World Bank was also supporting the expansion of large-scale cash crop agriculture first established during the colonial period. It promoted the expansion of their export of primary goods, that is, agricultural products and raw materials, so that they could acquire the foreign exchange they needed to buy exports from the First World. The World Bank also disseminated technologies produced in the First World in the Third World and pushed the capital-intensive model of the First World. Under Eisenhower's presidency, the US government decided that aid was key to prevent the further expansion of Soviet influence, but decided it would be better if it came from the World Bank as opposed to from the US government. A new branch was created within the World Bank to provide this aid. The US sought to use aid to quell discontented populations and trigger economic growth in geopolitically strategic areas in an effort to contain communism. Prior to 1963, when Woods came to head the World Bank, bankers and engineers had dominated in the technical departments of the bank. After 1963, economists came to play an increasingly important role, and the relationship between the bank and the IMF tightened. In 1968, McNamara became president of the bank. He increased spending on agriculture, education, and water supply, and decreased spending on infrastructure. The focus of the bank shifted to reducing poverty. He increased lending for rural development and sought to focus on basic needs. He left in 1981, and the basic needs agenda was dropped. With his departure, neoliberalism ascended to power, as desired by many of the economists within the bank, as well as supported by President Reagan and Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The International Monetary Fund, also formed at the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944, was established in response to the Great Depression. It was established to maintain global economic stability. The IMF was to be focused on stabilizing national currency exchanges in order to create a predictable and stable international system. It was responsible for maintaining a system of fixed exchange rates. Governments agreed to try to maintain the value of their currency relative to the US dollar so that currency values remained constant, so that they were not fluctuating relative to each other. There were restrictions on capital flows. Central banks in each country were supposed to buy and sell their currency at this fixed price and adopt monetary policy that maintained the set value of their currency relative to the US dollar. In other words, central banks couldn't print a bunch of money because that would put downward pressure on the value of their currency. The IMF was the global institution established to help when a country needed a short-term loan to cover a temporary payment imbalance. The IMF's role was also to revitalize and facilitate international trade in the wake of World War II. The General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs was also created in the period after World War II. The GATT, as it's known, was part of an effort to liberalize trade and establish rules for world trade. It was signed at the end of 1947 by 23 countries and went into effect in mid-1948. At this time, there was a failed attempt to create an international trade organization that would be part of the United Nations. The GATT was the only multilateral trade agreement governing international trade until the World Trade Organization was created in 1995. Over the period from 1948 to 1995, multiple trade rounds occurred as part of the GATT, and trade was liberalized over time. Over the period 1948 to 1980, tariffs on manufactured goods were decreased significantly. Up until the mid-1990s, agriculture had been mainly exempt from international trade rules at the insistence of the U.S. during the negotiations of the first GATT agreement in the 1940s. Agriculture was brought into these multilateral international trade negotiations during the Uruguay round of the GATT that occurred during the period 1986 to 1994, and ultimately produced both the World Trade Organization and the first agreement on agriculture. Unlike the World Bank and the IMF, the World Trade Organization is a formally democratic institution in that each country gets one vote. However, in practice, the US and other powerful countries set the agenda and have disproportionate influence on the agreements signed. This has created a lot of conflict within the WTO, with delegations from the Global South walking out and trade talks collapsing at times. Post-World War II, the U.S. wanted to expand its access to foreign markets in order to gain access to cheap raw materials to fuel its growing industries. It also wanted to find new markets for its products, as well as markets to invest its surplus capital. In the post-World War II period, the U.S. was focusing increasingly on industrial production, and its production of food and raw materials declined. The U.S. was consequently interested in seeing the development of primary industry in countries that were categorized as part of the Third World. The U.S. saw it as in its interest to promote the idea of development as a national project that involved mimicking the path taken by the U.S. The development project was also seen by the wealthy countries as important because after World War II, a concern emerged that global inequality, that is, inequality between nations, could produce global instability that in turn could threaten living conditions in wealthy countries. In the newly independent countries that emerged after World War II, there was a real need to address the issues of poverty and hunger that existed. The development project presented by the modernization theorists was offered by scholars in the U.S. along with the U.S. government as a way to address these problems. Escobar focuses on the power of the discourse that was created during this period in shaping what the problems were seen to be, how development was conceptualized, what was excluded from thought and discussion, and what the solutions were seen to be. Escobar says that the discourse shaped how we would think about development for decades to come. The Cold War played an important role in shaping this discourse. The U.S.'s global power was challenged by the socialist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Chinese communists coming to power. The U.S. and the USSR competed to win over the formerly colonial regions on an ideological level and to win access to their natural resources. Decolonization brought about new countries, which brought about the, quote, development project, as McMichael calls it. He says that it was both a blueprint for national political economic development and that it had a geopolitical purpose. As part of its Cold War strategy, the U.S. sought to extend its political, cultural, and economic influence. The development project was seen as a way to prevent the Third World from becoming communist. The U.S. saw its role as helping Third World countries get out of poverty so that they would choose capitalism. International aid, trade, and investment decisions were made to secure strategic regions for the U.S. and for U.S. business. The Cold War and the U.S.'s battle against communism led the U.S. to emphasize, through what Escobar refers to as the development discourse, the role of the individual, private initiative, and private property. The development discourse was shaped not only by the Cold War and U.S. economic interests, but also by concerns about overpopulation, as well as a belief in science and technology as the tools for delivering progress. Fear of overpopulation was high at this time. Discourses on population, including the development of scientific and technological instruments to manage it, were flourishing in fields such as demography, public health, and population biology. Following the sciences developed during the war's effort, like nuclear physics, there was a deep faith in science and technology, and this faith was incorporated into the new discourse of development. Patriarchy and ethnocentrism also influenced the form development took. This meant the development project presented the idea that indigenous had to be modernized and that they had to adopt European values and ideas. As such, class, racial, and gender inequality were structured into the development discourse. The development discourse presented governments and international organizations as key actors in the project of overcoming backwardness and underdevelopment. Rich countries had authority, and that modernization theory presented first world countries as having knowledge, capital, and experience, positioning them to tell the poor countries what to do to develop. The first world, through development theory, determined how development was conceptualized. It was based on the ideas and expectations of countries in the first world, what they saw as a normal course of progress. And there were international institutions like the World Bank, which, as we have learned, were heavily influenced by the wishes of first world countries, with authority in the realm of development and staffed by, quote, experts. The leaders of new states adopted the development discourse and declared that equality between nations was the goal. Development was seen as a way to pursue social justice. With independence, colonial subjects had become citizens, and now development would help continue to further that struggle for social justice. At least that was how it was conceived by many leaders in newly independent countries of the Third World. Development was conceived as a set of universally applicable technical interventions that would ensure the poor access to goods it was said that they needed. The development project was powerful because it could present itself as universal and natural, that it was not something to be contested. It was taken for granted. In the process, the Western model was legitimized, naturalized, taken as a way forward to be emulated. And in the process, the models and ideas that had existed in these formerly colonized societies were not valued, were marginalized, as you read about in McMichael. The unequal relations between the so-called First World and Third World were entirely ignored, as were any of the achievements or ideas of non-European cultures. But what Escobar argued was that development was not neutral. It had a political dimension. This development discourse and the institutions created and bestowed with expertise were a new and subtler form of power and control because they set the terms and boundaries of discussion and decided who was an expert. Escobar's argument is that the development discourse bounded or set the parameters of what could be said or even imagined.